He wasn't born a king, he wasn't meant to rule, but within a single lifetime, he bent the world's greatest republic to his will and paid for it in blood. Imagine a man so feared that senators stabbed him 23 times in public, not to kill his body, but to kill the idea of him. Imagine a general who marched on his own capital, who crossed a forbidden river with a single command that turned loyalty into treason and treason into destiny. This isn't a legend. This is the moment the Roman Republic, a 500-year-old machine of laws, armies, and tradition, was ripped apart by the hands of one man who refused to stop. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar, and the knives that silenced him could not stop what he had set in motion, the death of a republic and the birth of an empire that would change the world forever. This is not just history. This is the point where power, ambition, betrayal, and murder collide, and Rome itself bleeds. Born into a patrician family in Rome, the young Gaius Julius Caesar arrived not into immense wealth or political dominance, but into a lineage of fading glory. The gens Julia, though ancient and claiming descent from Aeneas and the goddess Venus herself, held little sway in the ruthless political arena of the late Republic. His father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, was a praetor who died when his son was just 16, leaving the family in a precarious financial state. His mother, Aurelia Cotta, was a woman of intelligence and fierce determination who hailed from a respected plebeian family, and she became a critical anchor for the young Caesar, instilling in him a sense of aristocratic pride combined with a practical, grounded worldview. The political environment was a maelstrom of civil unrest, a brutal contest for power between the populist faction led by his uncle by marriage, Gaius Marius, and the conservative optimates under the dictator Lucius Cornelius Sulla. This violent backdrop of proscriptions and civil war was the air Caesar breathed from his earliest days. His immediate environment was defined by the deep-seated political rivalries that split Rome. Growing up, Caesar witnessed firsthand the brutal purges carried out by Sulla, a man who saw his family as a threat due to their connection to the defeated Marius. This early struggle for survival taught him that in Rome, power was not given, it was taken, often with brutal force. The constant threat to his life and family, particularly after Sulla's rise to absolute power, forged a hardened resolve within him. He watched as the Republic tore itself apart, and this first-hand experience of political violence would deeply influence his own approach to power and his future actions. The challenges he faced were not just those of a young aristocrat seeking to make his mark, but of a young man fighting for his very existence in a city where one's lineage could be a death sentence. The young Caesar's personality was a complex blend of inherited traits and traits forged by his environment. He was noted for his sharp wit and charm, but beneath the surface lay an iron will and a ruthless ambition. He was a boy who understood that to survive, one had to be both charismatic and utterly pragmatic. He displayed an early fascination with rhetoric and oratory, seeing the spoken word as a key to influencing the masses. Unlike many of his peers who were content to live off their family name, he showed a burning desire to not just participate in Roman politics, but to dominate it. His hobbies were not just the typical aristocratic pursuits, they were tools for self-improvement and a path to power. He practiced his speeches diligently, studied military history with fervor, and engaged in athletic pursuits, not just for sport, but to hone his physical endurance, all in preparation for a future he was already meticulously planning. As he entered his teenage years, the political storm around him only intensified, forcing him to make his first life-altering decisions. Sulla, now the unquestioned master of Rome, saw the young Caesar as a potential rival due to his connection to the Marian faction, and ordered him to divorce his wife, Cornelia, whose father was a prominent member of the anti-Sullan party. Caesar, in a stunning act of defiance for a young man with no power, refused. This single act of rebellion against the most powerful man in Rome marked him for death. He was stripped of his inheritance and priesthood and forced to flee the city. This exile was not a defeat, but a turning point. It taught him the true cost of political conviction and the necessity of having a loyal following to survive. He would never again be so vulnerable. His time on the run was a period of intense character format. Ion. He served in the military campaigns in Asia Minor, where he gained his first taste of command and battlefield experience, distinguishing himself with bravery and skill. This was a young man no longer defined by his family name but by his own actions. He was a refugee, a soldier, and a survivor, all before the age of 20. The raw, visceral reality of war and the cold, calculated cruelty of politics shaped him into the leader he would become. He learned to command not just through rank but through respect. He learned that true power did not come from edicts, but from the unwavering loyalty of the men who followed you into battle. He was a man with a target on his back, and he was learning how to make that target a throne. The young Caesar's education was a reflection of his aristocratic upbringing, yet it was also shaped by the practical demands of his turbulent world. He was taught by the finest Roman and Greek tutors, mastering the classical curriculum of rhetoric, law, and philosophy. His studies were not for intellectual vanity, they were tools. His fluency in Greek in particular was not just a sign of a good education, but a strategic asset in the Hellenistic East, where he would later campaign. His primary passion was oratory, and he honed his skills with a ferocity that bordered on obsession, knowing that a single powerful speech could win over the Roman public, influence the Senate, or inspire legions. This mastery of language became his most formidable weapon, allowing him to connect with the common man in a way his patrician peers could not, a skill he cultivated relentlessly. His social interactions were a masterclass in networking and political charm. Though he was not born into a position of immense power, he deliberately sought out mentors and powerful allies. He befriended influential figures, learning their strengths and weaknesses, and cultivated a reputation for being both a sophisticated intellectual and a man of the people. This dual persona, at once a refined aristocrat and a populist hero, was a deliberate creation. He was a student of human nature, meticulously observing how power was wielded and how influence was gained. He understood that Rome's political landscape was a web of favors and debts, and he began weaving his own threads, laying the groundwork for a future he envisioned with breathtaking clarity. The early signs of his ambition were not subtle. Upon returning to Rome after Sulla's death, Caesar's first public act was to prosecute one of Sulla's former henchmen for extortion. Though he lost the case, it was a bold statement. Here was a young man with no political base openly challenging the legacy of a dead dictator, making it clear he was a force to be reckoned with. Later, when he was captured by Cilician pirates and held for ransom, his arrogance was legendary. He famously demanded that the pirates raise his ransom, scoffed at their amateurish threats, and promised to crucify them all once he was free, a promise he brutally kept. This audacity, this absolute self-belief in the face of death, was the first true glimpse of the unshakable confidence that would later define his rise. It was the moment the legend of Caesar truly began. As he moved from youth to early adulthood, his character was a paradox. He was renowned for his generous nature and willingness to forgive, yet he was also capable of a cold, calculated cruelty. He saw the world not through the lens of justice, but of power. His first encounters with political responsibility, particularly as a quaestor in Spain, were defined by his ruthless efficiency in administering justice and his ability to command respect from his troops. These experiences hardened his resolve and confirmed his belief that a strong hand was necessary to maintain order. He learned that a ruler's will must be absolute, a lesson he would later apply with terrifying precision to the entire Roman state. His family and the environment of the late Republic had an indelible impact on his decision-making. Having seen his family almost destroyed by political feuds, he resolved that he would never be a victim of circumstance. He saw the weakness of a system divided by competing factions and decided that the only way to achieve stability was to unite the state under a single supreme authority. His personal life was constantly intertwined with his political ambitions. Every marriage was an alliance, every child a pawn in a larger game. He was a man who saw the world as a game of chess, with the Republic itself as the board. His moves were always strategic, always calculated, and always aimed at a singular goal: absolute and total power. The formal education of Gaius Julius Caesar was meticulously curated, a standard practice for Roman noblemen, but he approached it with an ambition that set him apart. Taught by the finest Greek and Roman tutors, he immersed himself in the classical disciplines of rhetoric, literature, and philosophy. Latin and Greek were not merely languages he learned, they were instruments of power, especially Greek, which was the language of the Hellenistic world and a critical tool for future diplomacy and military command. His studies were not academic exercises, but a practical apprenticeship for political life. He saw law not as a rigid code, but as a malleable tool, and history not as a series of facts, but as a strategic manual. Every book he read, every lecture he attended, was a step toward his ultimate goal. Beyond the formal curriculum, Caesar's passions revealed a mind already focused on mastery. His most consuming passion was oratory. He spent countless hours perfecting his speeches, studying the rhythms of persuasion and the art of manipulating an audience's emotions. For Caesar, the spoken word was a battlefield, and he sought to be its undisputed general. This skill would later allow him to sway the masses in the forum and command the unwavering loyalty of his legions. Another of his passions was physical training. He was a man who understood that a sharp mind was useless without a strong body. He pursued athletic prowess with the same fervor he applied to his studies, preparing himself for the rigors of military command and the endurance required for a life of constant campaigning. Caesar's social interactions were a masterclass in strategic networking, a complex web he wove with meticulous care. Though his family lacked the immense political clout of the era's most powerful clans, Caesar made up for it with sheer charm and intellect. He deliberately sought out mentors and powerful patrons, attaching himself to influential figures like his uncle Gaius Marius and later the immensely wealthy Marcus Licinius Crassus. He understood that in Rome connections were currency, and he spent his youth building a formidable social capital. He was a student of human psychology, knowing when to charm, when to defer, and when to assert himself. His charisma was a deliberate, cultivated weapon. His intellectual development was a fusion of theory and brutal practicality. Unlike his peers who might study philosophy for its own sake, Caesar studied it for what it could teach him about human nature, about the levers of power, and about the nature of a state. He read history not to learn dates, but to analyze the strategies of great commanders and the mistakes of fallen rulers. His mind was a ruthless processor, taking in information and filtering it through a single, cold-blooded lens. How can this be used to gain power? This intellectual rigor, divorced from moral sentiment, would later allow him to make decisions that would shock his contemporaries, but were to him simply the logical consequence of a political calculation. The early signs of his ambition were impossible to ignore, flashes of an almost divine arrogance that would later define his public persona. As a young man, he openly defied the dictator Sulla, a choice that could have cost him his life and forced him into exile. This wasn't bravado. It was a calculated risk that announced his character to the world, a man who would not bend to a tyrant. Later, his encounter with pirates served as a chilling preview of his nature. When captured, he not only commanded his captors to increase his ransom, but he famously promised that once freed, he would return and crucify every last one of them. It was a threat he later fulfilled with brutal, methodical precision. His return to Rome after Sulla's death was not a passive homecoming, but a deliberate re-entry into the gladiatorial arena of politics. He was a man marked by exile, but that experience had forged within him an unyielding resolve. He no longer viewed the Roman system with the naive optimism of his youth. He saw it as a broken machine, ripe for a master mechanic to rebuild it in his own image. His early adulthood was a calculated campaign of re-establishing his influence. He leveraged his lineage and his newfound military experience to secure his first public office, a step that was not about service but about gaining a foothold from which to launch his ascent. His intellectual development had transformed from abstract study into a ruthless, pragmatic tool. His intellectual journey continued to evolve, moving from theory to application with every political move he made. He did not simply read about history, he used it as a blueprint for action. He saw the Republic's fatal flaw, its reliance on an outdated system of checks and balances that was easily manipulated by powerful, self-serving factions. His understanding of this flaw was not just academic, it was personal. He had suffered under that system. This realization fueled his ambition, making him an advocate for radical change, not out of any moral conviction, but because he saw a clear path for himself to become the solution to Rome's problems, the single figure capable of restoring order. As he began to take on more significant public roles, the raw elements of his leadership began to emerge with unmistakable clarity. His time as a quaestor in Spain provided a legendary moment that perfectly captured his boundless ambition. According to the accounts, upon seeing a statue of Alexander the Great, Caesar was overcome with emotion and wept openly, lamenting that by the age of 32, Alexander had conquered a world, while he, Caesar, had accomplished so little. This was not a moment of weakness, but a stark confession of his insatiable drive, a public declaration that he would not rest until he had surpassed every great man who had come before him. His social and political strategies were unlike those of his patrician peers. While other nobles cultivated the support of their fellow senators, Caesar systematically courted the common people. He saw that the true source of power in a republic was not the entrenched elite, but the vast, often overlooked masses. He spent enormous personal wealth on lavish games and public spectacles, not out of genuine generosity, but to buy their loyalty. This populist approach was a stroke of genius, creating a power base that was independent of the Senate and which would eventually become the engine of his revolution. He gave them bread and circuses, and in return they gave him something far more valuable, their unwavering devotion. All of Caesar's early experiences, the exile, the pirate capture, the tireless self-promotion, the methodical study, were not random events but the building blocks of a man forging his own destiny. He was a master of his own narrative, meticulously crafting the persona of a brilliant, unstoppable force. Every choice, every action was a calculated step towards a singular goal. His youth was not a period of aimless wandering, but a ruthless apprenticeship in the art of power. He was not born great. He made himself great, using the harsh realities of a crumbling republic as his schoolhouse and its corrupt politicians as his first invaluable enemies. He was a man who saw the world not as it was, but as he intended to make it. The teenage years of Gaius Julius Caesar were not a period of privileged indulgence, but a ruthless trial by fire that molded his character with brutal efficiency. His initial political miscalculation, the defiant refusal to divorce his wife Cornelia, forced him into exile, a harsh lesson for a boy of 16. Stripped of his inheritance and priesthood, he was a marked man, a fugitive from the most powerful dictator Rome had ever known, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. This experience taught him that in the world of Roman politics, loyalty was a dangerous luxury and that survival often depended on a cold, calculated pragmatism. He learned to navigate danger with a chilling self-assurance, realizing that his quick wit and charm were as valuable a shield as any legionaries. His first true encounters with war came during his exile. Fleeing to the east, he served in the Roman military, first in Asia Minor and later in Cilicia. These were not glorious campaigns, but brutal, grinding conflicts that provided a visceral education in the art of command and the harsh realities of combat. He distinguished himself with acts of bravery, earning a prestigious civic crown for saving a fellow soldier's life in battle. These early experiences forged within him a profound respect for the discipline of the legions and a deep understanding of military logistics. He was no longer a pampered aristocrat. He was a hardened soldier, and he learned that the true measure of a man was not his name, but his courage in the face of death. The political environment of Rome, a city fractured by civil war and simmering with old grudges, was the primary influence on his decision-making. He had seen his family almost destroyed and his faction annihilated. He witnessed the proscriptions, the public lists of enemies to be hunted down and killed, and understood that the Republic, as it was nothing more than a fictio particiis. His choices were never made on the basis of abstract ideals of justice or liberty, but on a raw, fundamental desire for self-preservation and the ultimate control of his own destiny. He learned that the only way to be truly safe was to be truly powerful, and that power could only be achieved by exploiting the weaknesses of a broken system. Upon his return to Rome, Caesar's youthful experiences manifested in a series of audacious, calculated political maneuvers. He began by targeting the symbols of Sulla's tyranny, prosecuting those who had profited from the purges. This was a bold and dangerous act, a public declaration that he was not afraid of the old guard. He then began to systematically build a power base, not through traditional patrician alliances, but by appealing directly to the common people. He used his inherited social standing to secure minor political offices, but he used his intellect and charisma to turn those offices into platforms for personal glory. This period was not without its strategic retreats. Sensing the need to further hone his skills, he traveled to Rhodes to study under Apollonius Molon, one of the most celebrated rhetoricians of the age. This was no leisurely sabbatical. For Caesar, rhetoric was the key to unlocking the Roman psyche, and he studied with a relentless intensity, perfecting the very weapon he would use to tear down the old order. His time there, far from the tumult of Rome, was a period of quiet, meticulous preparation, a master craftsman sharpening his tools before embarking on his greatest work. He was preparing not just to speak, but to command. Returning to Rome from Rhodes, Caesar was no longer the defiant youth, but a master strategist with a refined set of skills. He understood that oratory was not just about elegant words, but about wielding emotion, and he put that knowledge to immediate use. His return coincided with the death of Sulla, leaving a power vacuum and an opportunity for a man with a plan. He took on the role of prosecutor again, this time against a corrupt former governor, and though he again lost, he gained a crucial reputation as a champion of the people against the corrupt elite. Every move was a performance, a deliberate act designed to build a public persona that was at once charismatic and fiercely principled. His ascent continued with a meticulous focus on public perception. As aedile, a powerful public office, he used his own vast and often borrowed wealth to stage spectacles of breathtaking scale. The public games he sponsored were legendary, gladiatorial combats and wild animal hunts that thrilled the Roman populace. This was not a hobby, it was a ruthless political investment. He bankrupted himself for the sake of these displays, knowing that the loyalty of the Roman mob was worth more than any sum of money. While the Senate distrusted his populism, the people adored him, and their adoration was a force the Senate could not ignore, an unstoppable tide of popular support. As his influence grew, so did his network of alliances, and he began to form connections that would prove instrumental to his rise. He forged a powerful partnership with Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man of immense wealth and political cunning who saw in the young Caesar a useful tool for his own ambitions. Caesar, in turn, saw in Crassus a bottomless well of financial support, a resource he desperately needed to fund his political machine and pay off his crippling debts. This was not a bond of friendship, but a cold, transactional alliance, a mutual recognition of ruthless pragmatism that would serve as the foundation for their future conspiracy. The climax of his early political maneuvering was the formation of the First Triumvirate, an unholy alliance that would change the course of Roman history. He brought together two men who despised each other, the military hero Gnaeus Pompey Magnus and the wealthy political opportunist Marcus Licinius Crassus. Caesar was the indispensable link, the man with the charisma and popular support that neither of the others possessed. This was not a formal legal body, but a secret pact, a conspiracy to seize control of the Roman state from within, using their combined wealth, military power, and political influence to achieve their separate and often conflicting goals. It was an act of political betrayal on a massive scale. Every lesson from his youth, the defiance of Sulla, the calculated bravado with the pirates, the meticulous study of rhetoric, the ruthless pursuit of popular support, had led him to this moment. The triumvirate was the culmination of his early life, the perfect synthesis of a brilliant mind, an unshakable will, and a deep-seated contempt for the old order. He had not just survived the political storms of Rome, he had learned to manipulate them. He had gone from a vulnerable exile to a key player in a conspiracy to dominate the world. This was the moment his life's work truly began, and his ambition was no longer a personal trait, but a force of history ready to be unleashed. For Gaius Julius Caesar, marriage was not a matter of romantic affection, but a cold, hard political calculation. His first significant match was to Cornelia, the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, one of the most powerful opponents of the dictator Sulla. This union was a bold statement of his allegiance to the Popularis faction, a direct defiance of the dominant conservative order. It was a marriage that almost cost him his life. When Sulla demanded he divorce her, Caesar's refusal was a moment of shocking bravery and conviction, choosing loyalty to his wife and her family over his own safety. He was a man who understood that a strong alliance, even if it brought danger, was more valuable than a fragile peace. Amidst the political turmoil and forced exile of his youth, his marriage to Cornelia represented a rare bastion of personal stability. She bore him his only legitimate child, a daughter named Julia, and provided a domestic anchor in an otherwise chaotic existence. This period of his life, away from the public eye during his exile, was a fleeting glimpse of a private man, a husband, and a father. But even this domestic bliss was inextricably linked to his political fate. His refusal to abandon his family for Sulla was the very act that cemented his reputation as a man of unbreakable will, a man who would not compromise on his principles, a trait that would later terrify his enemies. The deaths of both Cornelia and his aunt Julia marked a turning point in his life, and he used their public funerals as a stage for his political ambitions. His subsequent marriages were even more transparently political. His second wife, Pompeia, was a relative of the powerful General Pompey the Great. This marriage was a clear signal of his desire to align himself with Rome's most celebrated military hero, even though Pompey was at that time a rival. His final wife, Calpurnia, was the daughter of a prominent senator, a union that further solidified his standing within the Roman elite. For Caesar, the marital bed was just another tool in his political arsenal, and he was a master of using it to his advantage. His only daughter, Julia, was the most important person in his life, yet she was also his most valuable political pawn. As she grew, she was groomed not for a life of quiet domesticity, but for a life of political service. Her fate was decided when her father brokered a marriage between her and the far older Cnaeus Pompey Magnus, the very man he had once sought to align with, and who was now his co-conspirator in the first triumvirate. This was a brutal and cold-blooded transaction, the love for a daughter traded for the promise of power. Their union was meant to be the unbreakable link that cemented the alliance between the two most ambitious men in Rome. Caesar's personal life was the foundation of his early political career. His marriages to influential women and the strategic use of his daughter as a political tool allowed him to build a web of alliances that a man of his limited financial means could never have otherwise afforded. His domestic affairs were public affairs, and he managed them with the same ruthless efficiency he would later bring to the battlefield. He learned early on that in the gladiatorial ring of Roman politics, everything was a resource, and he would use every person, every relationship, and every emotion to further his own inexorable march toward the pinnacle of power. His political genius lay in his ability to blur the lines between his personal life and his public ambition. The strategic placement of his family members, particularly his daughter Julia, into the highest echelons of Roman society was a political masterstroke. The marriage to Pompey the Great was not merely a family affair, it was the human face of a power-sharing pact that was, at its core, a ruthless conspiracy. This union symbolized a fragile peace between two titanic egos, a peace that was entirely dependent on the health and happiness of one young woman. His use of personal relationships as tools for political leverage was a sign of his cold, calculating mind, a trait that would later lead him to make decisions of terrifying consequence. As he matured into his 30s, his role in governance expanded with breathtaking speed, a testament to his ambition and the effectiveness of his alliances. His election as Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, was a masterstroke of political maneuvering. This was not a military or administrative role, but a position of immense social and religious authority, giving him control over state religion and an air of divine right. It was an audacious act for a man of his age, a clear signal that he intended to dominate every facet of Roman life, from the military to the sacred. His enemies watched in horror as he systematically built his power base, step by inexorable step, on a foundation of charisma and cold-blooded strategy. His first true test of high command came with his appointment as propraetor to govern the province of Hispania. This was a chance to prove his military credentials, and more importantly, to acquire the immense wealth he desperately needed to pay off his debts and fund his political machine. He did not disappoint. He launched a series of brutal, efficient campaigns, subjugating the local tribes with a speed and ferocity that stunned his contemporaries. He returned to Rome not just with a victorious army, but with a fortune of plunder that made him financially independent for the first time in his life. The soldier-turned-governor was now a force to be reckoned with. Returning victorious from Spain, he stood at the precipice of his ultimate ambition, the consulship, the highest office in the Republic. But the Senate, a body of men who had watched his rise with growing fear, sought to block him. They offered him a triumph, a glorious victory parade, but a law stipulated that he must disband his army to enter the city to stand for election. The Senate gave him a cruel choice, a public victory or a chance at supreme power. They believed they had him cornered, that his vanity would choose the triumph. They underestimated the depth of his ambition and his utter contempt for their rules. Caesar made his choice in a moment of stunning defiance. He renounced his triumph and entered Rome as a candidate for consul, gambling his public glory for the chance to seize absolute power. With the immense financial backing of Crassus and the military might of Pompey behind him, his election was a foregone conclusion. His path to the consulship had been paved not by legal tradition, but by the ruthless force of his allies and the unwavering loyalty of the people he had so meticulously cultivated. His election was a signal to the Republic that the old order was dead, and a new age of raw, unrestrained power had begun. The year 59 BC was not an election, it was a hostile takeover. Gaius Julius Caesar, with the combined might of Pompey's legions and Crassus's wealth behind him, ascended to the consulship. His co-consul, Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, was a staunch conservative who had vowed to block every single one of Caesar's proposed populist reforms. The public perception was split. The common people saw him as their champion, a man who would finally deliver on promises of land and justice, while the senatorial elite viewed him with a combination of fear and loathing, a dangerous demagogue who threatened to unravel the very fabric of the republic. The stage was set for a brutal confrontation, not between two politicians, but between a revolutionary and a dying system. His initial days as consul were a masterclass in political brutality. He was met with immediate, determined resistance from the Senate, a body that used every legal tool at its disposal to obstruct his agenda. But Caesar was not interested in legalities. He had his own advisors, Pompey and Crassus, and his own enforcers, a mob of veterans and urban thugs. His first decisions were not compromises, but ultimatums. He brought his populist land bill directly to the people, bypassing the Senate entirely. When Bibulus tried to veto the bill, Caesar used a mixture of intimidation and outright violence, having his co-consul assaulted in the forum, a public humiliation that turned him into a terrified recluse. The tactics he employed were shocking and entirely illegal. He had Bibulus's fasces, the symbols of consular authority, smashed, a public act of defiance that signaled the death of co-consular power. Bibulus was forced to withdraw from public life entirely, resigning himself to the shadows and leaving Caesar with undisputed one-man rule. The Senate, watching in terror, could do nothing as he passed law after law, each one a direct assault on their power. He distributed vast tracts of land to Pompey's veterans and the poor, and he ratified a series of lucrative tax contracts for Crassus's business allies. This was no longer a government. It was a conspiracy fulfilling its darkest promises. His absolute control as consul was the first and most important part of a three-way deal. Caesar was the indispensable agent, the man who used his political genius and raw force to deliver on the promises made by the triumvirate. Pompey, the military hero, got the land he had promised to his loyal soldiers, securing their devotion to him. Crassus, the man of wealth, had his financial interests protected, making him richer still. And Caesar, the man who had been nearly penniless just a few years before, got the prize he had sought all along, a 5-year command in the vast, untamed territories of Gaul. This was his ticket to unassailable power. The choice of Gaul was no accident. It was a brilliant and brutal strategic move. The Senate, desperate to be rid of him, likely saw it as a place where he would either fail or be consumed by the wild tribes. But Caesar saw an opportunity. Gaul was a massive, unpacified territory, rich in resources and ripe for conquest. It was a place where he could raise his own army, forge his own fortune, and earn the military glory that was the only path to true power in Rome. His appointment as proconsul was the final, critical step in his ascent, and he departed for his new command knowing that he was not just a politician, but a king in the making. His departure from Rome was not a retreat, but a deliberate move to a new stage. He left behind a city and a senate he had humiliated, their bitter animosity a testament to his ruthless efficiency. The Senate believed they were exiling a problem. They were in fact granting a military genius the very tool he needed to seize absolute power. He went to Gaul not as a mere governor, but as a sovereign in his own right, with a vast territory, a loyal army, and a singular ambition to prove that his authority was not derived from the Senate, but from his own military genius. He would no longer be a politician negotiating for power. He would be a warlord taking it. Upon arriving in Gaul, he immediately confronted a crisis, a massive migration of the Helvetii people through Roman territory. He seized this opportunity not just to repel them, but to launch a series of preemptive, brutal campaigns that would justify his continued presence and military action. His first move was to demonstrate his terrifying efficiency. He met the Helvetii in battle and annihilated them, a shocking display of force that sent a ripple of fear through all the tribes of Gaul. This wasn't a defense of the Roman border, it was a declaration of war on an entire continent, a clear signal that Caesar would not rest until every tribe was either subjugated or destroyed. His military campaigns in Gaul began with a ferocity that stunned both his enemies and his own men. He fought with a relentless speed, marching his legions through impassable terrain and through punishing winters to catch his enemies unprepared. His strategy was a brutal mix of rapid assault, siege warfare, and total subjugation. He did not seek to merely defeat his opponents, he sought to annihilate them, to leave no doubt as to who held absolute power. The rivers of Gaul ran red with the blood of tribes who dared to resist, and the conquered heard. Roar's legend grew with every battle, a terrifying new force in the Roman world. With every victory, Caesar's personal wealth and power grew exponentially. The conquests were not just for Rome, but for himself. He plundered cities, enslaved entire populations, and sent vast amounts of gold back to Italy, using it to pay off his debts, fund his political allies, and buy ever-increasing loyalty from his men. He was no longer dependent on the likes of Crassus for money. He was a self-sustaining engine of conquest, a man whose personal fortune was now tied directly to the bloodshed he inflicted. He was building not just an army, but a personal empire, far from the watchful eyes of a Senate that had believed it had banished him. By the end of his first year in Gaul, Caesar had transformed from a Roman politician to an unstoppable military force. The years he had spent studying military strategy were now being put to the most brutal and effective use. His legions, forged in the crucible of Gallic warfare, were no longer just Roman soldiers, they were Caesar's men, loyal to him above all else. He had found his true calling, and his command of Gaul was his school, his fortress, and his personal fiefdom. The Gallic Wars would not only conquer a land, but would also produce the man who would eventually march his ironclad legions on Rome itself, ready to seize the ultimate prize. The Gallic Wars were a brutal 7-year-long campaign of conquest that began with a lie and ended with a continent drenched in blood. The initial pretext was a defensive one, to protect Roman territory from migrating tribes, but Caesar's ambition quickly turned it into a war of total domination. His first major engagement was the Battle of the Arar against the Helvetii, a victory so complete it left their forces shattered. This was followed by a ferocious attack on the Suebi, a Germanic tribe. His strategy was deceptively simple: relentless speed, merciless efficiency, and a willingness to commit to total war. He never allowed his enemies a moment to breathe, a tactic that would become his military hallmark. Caesar's relations with his soldiers were a defining aspect of his command. He was not a general who led from the rear. He was always at the front, sharing their hardships and fighting alongside them. He learned the names of his centurions and legionaries, and he was famously generous with plunder and rewards. Ensuring their loyalty was to him personally, not to the distant Senate in Rome. His military tactics were a marvel of innovation and ruthlessness. He pioneered the use of a combined arms approach, using cavalry, infantry, and siege engines in perfect coordination. He was a master of engineering, famously building a bridge across the Rhine in just 10 days, a feat that was as much a psychological weapon as a physical one. The impact of his campaigns on the local population was devastating beyond measure. For the Gallic people, this was not a war of liberation, but an apocalypse. Cities and villages were put to the torch. Entire tribes were wiped out in massacres, and an estimated 1 million people were enslaved. He was a conqueror who did not believe in a gentle hand. His justice was swift, and his punishments were brutal, designed to terrify any potential future. He resistance into submission. The rivers of Gaul ran red with the blood of those who dared to defy him, and his name became a byword for a terrifying, unstoppable force that brought not just victory but total destruction. A moment that showed the true mettle of the man came during the Battle of the Sambre. Caught completely by surprise by a massive Nervii assault, his legions were on the brink of annihilation. Amidst the chaos and carnage as his men faltered, Caesar himself rushed to the front lines, fighting sword in hand, rallying his terrified soldiers by example. He was a man possessed, a force of nature who refused to accept defeat. His personal courage and his ability to inspire his men turned a certain rout into a miraculous victory, cementing his status not just as a brilliant strategist, but as a warrior who would never break, no matter the odds. Driven by an insatiable need for glory, his campaigns extended far beyond the borders of Gaul. He launched two audacious, yet ultimately fruitless, invasions of Britain, not for strategic gain, but to be the first Roman to conquer the mysterious fabled island. He also crossed the Rhine into Germania, an act of sheer intimidation designed to send a chilling message to the Germanic tribes. These were not military necessities, but acts of pure ego, a desperate grab for a legacy that could not be denied. He was no longer just conquering territory, he was conquering the Roman imagination, forcing them to see him as an unrivaled hero, a demigod of war. His reputation as a demigod of war had an unintended consequence. It unified the very people he sought to conquer. The Gallic tribes, weary of his brutal conquest and watching their world burn, finally set aside their ancient rivalries to form a single, terrifying alliance. This was a direct consequence of his merciless tactics. He had become a monster so universally feared that he forced a fragmented people to become a single, coherent nation with a singular goal: to drive him out of their land or die trying. The rebellion was not a surprise. It was an inevitable consequence of the rivers of blood he had shed across the continent. At the head of this desperate rebellion was a brilliant and charismatic chieftain named Vercingetorix, a man who would become Caesar's most formidable opponent. Vercingetorix understood that he could not win a conventional battle against the disciplined Roman legions, so he employed a strategy of devastating brilliance, a scorched earth policy. He burned his own cities and crops to deny Caesar's army supplies, forcing the Romans to live on the brink of starvation. This was a war of attrition and psychological warfare, and for the first time in years, Caesar found himself on the defensive, his back against the wall. The entire conflict reached its dramatic climax in the great fortress city of Alesia. After a series of tactical defeats, Vercingetorix and his main army were cornered and besieged inside the city walls. This was the moment Caesar had been waiting for, a chance to end the war with a single, decisive blow. He knew that a massive Gallic relief army was on its way, but instead of retreating, he made a decision of breathtaking audacity. He would lay siege to the city while simultaneously building a second outer wall of fortifications to fight off the relief army. What followed was an engineering marvel and an act of chilling strategic genius. Caesar's army of fewer than 50,000 men built a gigantic 13-mile-long ring of fortifications around the city of Alesia to keep Vercingetorix's forces trapped inside. But then, facing the massive relief force that was now approaching, he ordered his men to build a second 20-mile-long ring of fortifications facing outward, turning his army into a fortress. His men were surrounded, trapped between a besieged enemy and a gigantic relief army. This was a gamble of insane proportions, a testament to his absolute confidence in himself and his legions. The final battle for Alesia was an epic of survival and slaughter. With the Roman legions caught in a deadly vice, fighting on both sides of their fortifications, the battle raged. The besieged Gauls within Alesia launched a desperate last-ditch assault, while the massive relief force hammered at the outer walls. Caesar himself, mounted and wearing a scarlet cloak for all to see, rode from point to point, inspiring his men to fight with a fury they did not know they possessed. The final Gallic charge was broken, and with it, the rebellion shattered. Vercingetorix surrendered, kneeling at Caesar's feet. The Gallic wars were over, and a new master of war, forged in a furnace of blood and steel, was ready to claim his final prize. After the conquest of Gaul, Caesar's genius was no longer confined to the battlefield. It extended to the brutal art of governance. He managed his new vast territory with a chilling mix of pragmatism and ruthlessness. His administration was efficient, a well-oiled machine for extracting resources and maintaining order. He established Roman law where it had not existed, but the enforcement of that law was absolute and often cruel. While he granted some tribes limited autonomy, he crushed any hint of rebellion with a terrifying swiftness, showing that the fate of those who defied Rome was total annihilation. He was a tyrant in a toga, ruling his new domain with an iron fist, yet his rule brought a sort of dark, enforced peace. His economic policies were a direct extension of his military conquest. The plunder from Gaul was staggering. Gold, slaves, and resources poured into Roman coffers, and a significant portion of it flowed directly into Caesar's personal fortune. He managed this wealth with a financial acumen that rivaled his military prowess. He established new trade routes, set up a system of tribute and taxation that was both lucrative for Rome and deeply exploitative of the Gallic people. He used this immense wealth to fund his political machine back home and to ensure the loyalty of his legions with lavish bonuses, a strategy that made him richer and more powerful with every act of conquest. The Gauls' rebellions, particularly the one led by Vercingetorix, were not just military challenges, but a political test of his management. His response to betrayal was swift and merciless. When the city of Uxellodunum rebelled after Vercingetorix's defeat, Caesar, enraged by their defiance, had the hands of all the surviving defenders amputated, a horrifying act of brutality designed to send a clear message. Submission was the only option. This brutal justice, while it horrified some in Rome, was a central tenet of his governance. He knew that for his rule to be absolute, his enemies had to be not just defeated but broken, their will to resist crushed forever. While Caesar was busy conquering Gaul, the republic he had left behind was unraveling, its core political structure collapsing under the weight of his ambition. His enemies in the Senate, led by the steadfastly conservative Cato and the brilliant orator Cicero, used his long absence to chip away at the triumvirate. They knew the public's devotion to Caesar was a threat, and they worked tirelessly to undermine his authority. The political environment in Rome was a cauldron of plots and counterplots, with a fearful Senate desperately trying to reassert its authority before the returning conqueror arrived to claim his final prize. The human glue that held the triumvirate together began to dissolve, leaving a power vacuum and an unstoppable conflict. The death of Marcus Crassus in a disastrous campaign in Parthia removed one leg of the three-man alliance. But the final fatal blow came with the death of Caesar's beloved daughter Julia in childbirth. Her death severed the personal bond between Caesar and Pompey, the very link that had prevented their rivalry from boiling over into war. With Crassus dead and Julia gone, the two most powerful men in Rome were left to confront each other, their alliance a forgotten memory, and their friendship a bitter, painful lie. The Senate, emboldened by the deaths of his two most powerful allies, saw its chance. It delivered a series of increasingly frantic ultimatums, demanding that he give up his military command and return to Rome as a private citizen. They intended to strip him of his power, prosecute him for his illegal acts as consul, and destroy him politically, perhaps even physically. They had the legal high ground, but he had something far more potent. An army of loyal, battle-hardened veterans who were devoted to him, not to the state. His political management had paid off, creating a force that would choose him over their homeland. Pompey, once his son-in-law and closest ally, now stood at the head of the Senate's legions, tasked with defending the Republic. He was the most celebrated general of his age, a man who had been the face of Roman military might for a generation. The stage was set for a civil war of epic proportions, a conflict not between Rome and an external enemy, but between two titans of the Republic, each believing he was fighting for the soul of the state. The political machinations had failed, and now the final arbiter would be not the Senate, but the sword. Caesar, still in Gaul, used all his political cunning to delay the inevitable. He sent a series of letters to Rome, offering to compromise, to give up his command if only Pompey would do the same. But the Senate, blinded by its hatred and led by the unyielding Cato, refused to negotiate. They were convinced that Caesar was a tyrant in the making and that any concession would spell the end of the Republic. The political environment had become so toxic that reason and compromise were no longer possible, and the path to peace had been utterly destroyed by the very men who claimed to defend it. The final brutal ultimatum arrived, a senatorial decree declaring a state of emergency and ordering all Roman citizens to defend the Republic against Caesar. He had been given a choice, and it was a choice between political ruin and war. To return to Rome without his army was to face certain imprisonment, exile, or death. But to cross the border with his army was an act of open rebellion, a declaration that the laws of the Republic no longer applied to him, that his own will was the supreme law of the land. It was a life-altering decision, with the fate of millions hanging in the balance. Standing on the bank of the small, insignificant river known as the Rubicon, the border between his province and sacred Italy, he made the most momentous decision of his life. He stood in silent contemplation, the fate of the Republic in his hands, before uttering the words that would echo for eternity. Alea iacta est. The die is cast. With that single chilling phrase, he plunged his nation into a bloody civil war. He led his single legion across the river, his own personal army, ready to destroy the Republic he had been accused of betraying. It was a final, brutal act of defiance that would either make him a king or a corpse. With the Republic now his personal playground, Caesar's lifestyle reflected his absolute power. He lived with a level of luxury and opulence that was once unthinkable for a Roman of his station. His personal habits were a paradox. A man of immense physical endurance, who was rumored to be a man of many vices. He was a vegetarian, a surprising habit for a Roman, and he was known to drink heavily at banquets, though he was said to be able to hold his liquor. But despite the outward show of power and control, he suffered from a terrifying secret, what modern historians believe was epilepsy, a condition he may have feared would be seen as a sign of divine disfavor or personal weakness. His family life was constantly a part of his political strategy, but a few personal bonds ran deeper. The death of his daughter, Julia, had shattered the political alliance with Pompey, but it had also been a crushing personal loss for Caesar, who was deeply devoted to her. His relationships with women, particularly his famous scandalous affair with Cleopatra, were a source of fascination and outrage in Rome. His relationship with the Egyptian queen was not a secret. It was a public display of his disregard for traditional Roman values and a symbol of his power. He brought her to Rome, where she lived openly, a foreign queen in a city that despised her. His tyranny, a slow, creeping poison that began with his consulship, was now a harsh and undeniable reality. He was not a senseless tyrant, but a pragmatic one. His justice system was often swift and harsh, designed not to be fair but to be efficient and to instill terror. While he was famous for his clemency towards many of his former enemies, notably Cicero, this was not an act of genuine mercy, but a calculated political move to win over his opponents and appear magnanimous. But for those who defied him, particularly in the provinces, his punishments were terrifying, an iron fist that crushed any and all resistance. The controversies surrounding his life were endless, each one a nail in the coffin of the Republic. He flaunted his wealth and his power in a way that shocked the conservative Roman elite. His open affair with Cleopatra, a foreign queen with a child by him, was a gross violation of Roman social norms and a public display of his disregard for their traditions. He was also deeply in debt for much of his life, a constant source of scandal that his enemies used against him. But to the Roman people, these scandals only enhanced his image as a man who lived outside the rules, a god among mere mortals. As dictator for life, his rule was marked by a flurry of public works projects and ambitious reforms. He had the power to make them happen, and he used it. He reformed the Roman calendar, creating the Julian calendar that we still use today, a feat of scientific and political genius. He planned massive public works projects to employ the poor, drained swamps, and founded colonies for his veterans. These were not just reforms, they were monuments to his greatness, a way of cementing his legacy. He was creating a city in his own image, a city that could not function without him, a move that made him seem indispensable to the people. His political brilliance and relentless reforms were, in the eyes of his enemies, the clear marks of a man who would not stop until he wore a crown. The Senate, a body of men who had fought their entire lives to preserve the Republic, watched in terror as he systematically dismantled their power, one decree at a time. His reforms were not seen as progress, but as chains. They feared his popularity, a force that could bypass their authority entirely. and they loathed his open disregard for the traditions that had held their world together for centuries. He had become an emperor in all but name, and they knew that if they did not act, the Republic would be dead forever. The final straw for the Senate was a series of increasingly brazen moves that proved his tyrannical intent beyond any doubt. He had himself appointed dictator for life, an unprecedented title that made a mockery of the temporary nature of Roman dictatorships. He had statues of himself erected in public places, and his head was placed on Roman coins, an honor previously reserved for gods. The most shocking moment came when he refused to stand and greet a delegation of senators, an act of such staggering arrogance that it left them speechless with rage. This was no longer a matter of politics, it was a matter of life and death for the Republic itself. The conspiracy to end his life was born not from his bitter enemies, but from the very men he had pardoned. It was a conspiracy of betrayal, led by men he had shown mercy to, men who felt his clemency was an insult to their republican ideals. The ringleaders were Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus. Brutus was a man whose life Caesar had saved after the Battle of Pharsalus, a man he had loved and trusted like a son. Cassius was a former enemy who had been pardoned by Caesar and given a key position. This was not a revolt, it was a conspiracy of vengeance, a twisted act of gratitude for men who believed his tyranny had to be stopped. The personal drama of the betrayal was immense. Brutus, a man who believed in the principles of the Republic above all else, was torn between his love for Caesar and his belief that the man had become a tyrant. The conspirators used this conflict against him, leaving him anonymous messages that spoke of his duty to Rome, to his ancestors, and to the Republic. They knew that if they could turn Brutus, the moral heart of the conspiracy, the people would see it not as an assassination but as an act of justice. The man Caesar had protected and promoted, the man who was rumored to be his own son, would be the one to betray him. On the Ides of March 44 BC, the forces of his personal life and his tyrannical ambition converged in a single bloody moment. He had been warned by seers and by his own wife Calpurnia, who had a vivid nightmare of his death, but Caesar, blinded by his own hubris, ignored their pleas. He walked into the Senate, a building he had once dominated with his words, and was met not by the cheers of his supporters, but by a circle of men with knives. His personal fear of weakness and his absolute conviction of his own invincibility led him to his final moments, a tyrant felled by the very men he had pardoned, his life ending in a violent, shocking spectacle of betrayal. Having crossed the Rubicon, Caesar's civil war was a series of swift, brutal campaigns that demonstrated his strategic genius was far superior to that of his enemies. Instead of marching directly on Rome, he executed a brilliant lightning campaign through Italy, forcing the unprepared Pompey and the Senate to abandon the capital. He then launched a daring, rapid campaign in Spain, defeating Pompey's loyalist legions there with a cunning siege and a quick battle, showing his mastery of both strategy and logistics. His war was not a slow grind, but a terrifying flash of overwhelming force, catching his opponents completely off guard and leaving them no time to rally. His main enemies were not foreign barbarians, but the very heart of the Roman Republic he had once served. His strongest opponent was his former friend and son-in-law, Gnaeus Pompey Magnus, the great, the most celebrated general of his age. The two men, once inseparable allies, were now locked in a bloody civil war, each commanding legions of veteran soldiers who had once fought side by side. The war was fueled by the political and personal betrayals of the First Triumvirate, a conflict that had become a bitter feud between two titans, each believing he was the last hope for a dying republic. Despite his strategic brilliance, Caesar was not invincible, and he suffered significant losses and humiliating setbacks. The most notable was his defeat at Dyrrhachium, where Pompey skillfully outmaneuvered him, inflicting heavy casualties and forcing a retreat. This was a crushing blow to Caesar's morale and his reputation. The defeat was so severe that Caesar himself later admitted that the enemy general, who had a chance to win the entire war for the Republic, was Pompey. If only Pompey had known how to follow up his victory. This defeat was a stark reminder of his mortality, a personal setback that only fueled his doubt. A sire for ultimate revenge. After Dyrrhachium, the two armies finally met in the decisive clash that would determine the fate of Rome. The Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC was the ultimate confrontation between two Roman generals. Pompey had the larger army, but Caesar had the battle-hardened veterans of Gaul and a superior strategic mind. Caesar's genius was on full display as he used a brilliant flanking maneuver to shatter Pompey's superior cavalry and turn the tide of the battle. The defeat was total. Pompey's army was annihilated and his legions were scattered to the winds. The great general himself fled, leaving his entire army to be destroyed. The shocking aftermath of Pharsalus was a brutal testament to the nature of their rivalry. Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking refuge with the young Ptolemy XIII, the brother of Cleopatra. But instead of offering sanctuary, the Egyptians, eager to curry favor with the victorious Caesar, betrayed their former ally in the most shocking way possible. Pompey was beheaded as he stepped from his boat, his severed head presented to Caesar upon his arrival, a grisly trophy. Caesar, legend says, wept at the sight, not for his rival's death, but for the indignity of it. He had wanted to defeat Pompey in battle, not see him murdered like a common criminal. His time in Egypt was not the quiet, romantic interlude historians sometimes imagine. It was a brutal and desperate war for survival. Trapped in the city of Alexandria with a small, exhausted army, he found himself besieged by the Egyptian forces of Ptolemy XIII. This was a war he came dangerously close to losing, a moment of profound vulnerability for the man who had just conquered the Roman world. He fought not for glory, but for his life, and his victory was a testament to his sheer tenacity and his ability to command even when all seemed lost. He was no longer a conqueror, but a cornered animal, fighting with the same ferocity he had shown when captured by pirates. It was during this harrowing siege that he became utterly entwined with the young and brilliant Queen Cleopatra. Their relationship was not just a diplomatic affair, but a passionate, scandalous romance that produced a son, Caesarion. This public liaison with a foreign monarch was a direct violation of Roman tradition and a source of deep offense to the conservative elite back home. But for Caesar, it was a symbol of his newfound status. He was no longer a Roman citizen bound by their rules. He was a king, a god, a man who could take a foreign queen as his lover and bring her and his son to Rome, flaunting his contempt for their norms. After escaping the chaos of Egypt, he was forced to turn his attention to the last remaining pockets of resistance. In North Africa, the remnants of Pompey's army had regrouped, led by the unyielding fanatic figure of Cato the Younger. Cato was the ultimate symbol of republican virtue, a man who would rather die than live under a tyrant. The conflict was no longer about personal ambition, but about the soul of Rome itself. The clash at the Battle of Thapsus was a brutal and final reckoning, a complete and total rout for the Republican forces, an annihilation that left no doubt as to Caesar's supremacy. In a final act of heartbreaking defiance, Cato chose to end his own life rather than fall into the hands of a man he considered a tyrant. After the battle, upon hearing of his final defeat, he took his own life, a sacrifice for the republic he knew was already dead. This was a moment of deep personal drama and tragedy. Cato's suicide was a powerful statement, a final act of resistance that stripped Caesar of his final victory, the chance to offer clemency and once again prove his mercy to his opponent. Cato's death made him a martyr for the Republican cause, a ghost that would forever haunt Caesar's rule. Caesar's final campaign was a bloody, desperate fight against Pompey's two sons, Gnaeus and Sextus, in Spain. The Battle of Munda was his final, most terrifying test, a near defeat that he himself later said he fought not for victory, but for his very life. His legions were on the brink of being routed when he, in a final act of pure desperation and courage, charged the enemy lines. A single man against an entire army, rallying his terrified men to one final charge. His victory was total and final. Pompey's sons were killed or scattered, and the last vestiges of Republican resistance were utterly crushed. He was now the undisputed master of the Roman world. Having conquered the known world, Gaius Julius Caesar found himself in a state of supreme yet precarious isolation. The immense stress of a decade of relentless warfare and the burden of absolute power began to take a heavy toll on his physical and mental health. The epileptic seizures that had plagued him for years became more frequent, a terrifying vulnerability for a man who projected an image of divine strength. He became more paranoid, trusting fewer and fewer people. The man who had once been a master of human nature now saw enemies in every shadow, a conqueror haunted by the fear of a final fatal betrayal. While his Civil War enemies were scattered or dead, his absolute rule did not bring a lasting peace. The empire, though united under his iron fist, was simmering with resentment. His harsh justice and the appointment of loyalists to key positions created a deep, festering anger among the old Roman elite, who felt their power had been stripped away. There were no overt rebellions, but there were countless small, quiet acts of defiance and a constant, whispered stream of conspiracies. He was a man who ruled over a kingdom of ghosts, with the specter of the Republic haunting every one of his steps. The greatest challenges he faced were not external threats, but internal struggles and court betrayals. He had pardoned many of his former enemies and even promoted them to positions of power, believing that his clemency would win them over. But it did not. It only intensified their desire to see him fall. The Senate, a body he had once so skillfully manipulated, was now a cauldron of seething resentment. The senators felt humiliated, stripped of their honor and their voice. Their ultimate enemy was not a foreign invader, but the tyrant who sat on the throne they had once shared. His increasing arrogance was the fuel for their rage. He had himself appointed dictator for life, an act so brazen it shattered the last illusions of the Republic. He began to appear in public wearing a golden laurel wreath, an honor reserved for a victorious general. He accepted the title of Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland, and gave himself divine honors, actions that left no doubt as to his monarchical ambitions. The Senate, a body that had once debated the fate of empires, now watched in silent fury as he made a mockery of their traditions and their history, acting as a king in all but name. The most shocking moment came during the festival of the Lupercalia, a public ritual where Caesar sat on his gilded throne, a king in all but name. His loyal subordinate, Mark Antony, approached him and in front of the entire crowd offered him a royal diadem, a crown. The crowd erupted in a roar, not of approval, but of disapproval. Caesar for a moment seemed to hesitate, but he ultimately pushed the crown away, saying that only Jupiter was king in Rome. But to many of his enemies, this was no rejection. It was a performance, a cynical test of the people's reaction to his kingship, a final confirmation of their worst fears. His refusal of the diadem only intensified the plotting against him. For the conspirators, it was not a genuine act of humility, but a cynical play to gauge public reaction. They knew his ambition, and they knew it would not be satisfied until he was an absolute king. The conspiracy, once a whispered secret, was now a plan of action. The conspirators decided there was no time to lose. They chose the Ides of March, the day he was set to attend a Senate meeting, as the day he would die. They would strike in the heart of the Republic, in the very building he had so thoroughly humiliated. As the day of the assassination drew closer, the tension was immense, a palpable fear in the air. The conspirators, a mix of men he had pardoned and men he had promoted, were consumed by a desperate paranoia. They feared they would be discovered at any moment, that Caesar, the master manipulator, would find out about their plot and have them executed. Each of them, from the fanatical Cassius to the conflicted Brutus, knew that if they failed, their lives would be forfeit, and the Republic would be dead forever. Every day was a nerve-wracking gamble with their lives. In the final days before his death, the omens and warnings became impossible to ignore. A soothsayer had famously warned him to beware the Ides of March. On the very morning of the assassination, his wife Calpurnia woke from a vivid nightmare in which she saw him murdered, and she begged him not to go to the Senate. She was so insistent that he almost stayed home, but his pride and the subtle mockery of a conspirator ultimately convinced him to go. He was a man who believed in his own destiny, and he refused to be swayed by a woman's dream. As he made his way to the Senate, fate gave him one last chance to escape. A scroll containing a list of the conspirators was thrust into his hands by a panicked slave boy who had found out about the plot. But Caesar, ever the busy ruler, refused to read it, putting it with his other papers, saying he would read it later. His hubris, his absolute belief in his own invincibility, had sealed his fate. He had walked past the soothsayer on his way to the Senate and had even mocked him, saying, The Ides of March have come. The soothsayer, in a chilling whisper, replied, "Aye, Caesar, but not gone." He entered the Senate building and took his seat, a man at the pinnacle of human power. He was surrounded by a circle of men he believed to be his friends, his allies, the men he had pardoned and promoted. But they were not his friends. They were his executioners. He sat on his gilded throne, a king in all but name, in the very heart of the republic he had betrayed. The stage was set, the knives were drawn, and the ghost of the republic, personified in the very men he had shown mercy to, was about to deliver its final brutal justice. The death of Gaius Julius Caesar did not come from the battlefield or from old age. It came from the knives of the very men he had shown mercy to. He was assassinated in the Senate on the Ides of March, 44 BC, a violent act of betrayal that ended his life in a spectacle of raw political violence. The civil war he had fought to end was replaced by a brutal, shocking murder, a desperate final gasp from the dying republic to rid itself of the man who had become its king. His death was not a peaceful end, but a public execution, a bloody tableau of vengeance and fear. The first blow came as he sat in his curule chair, a single decisive stab from a conspirator named Casca. Caesar's first reaction was one of fury, a final flash of the warrior who had conquered a continent. He rose from his chair, a man of 55, and grabbed Casca's arm, shouting, "Why, you villainous Casca, what are you doing?" But his resistance was futile. He was immediately surrounded by a circle of men, the very senators he had so recently humiliated, and the knives began to plunge into him, a relentless, shocking storm of steel and betrayal. The full brutality of the attack was sickening to behold. The conspirators, in a frenzy of rage and fear, stabbed him repeatedly. According to the ancient accounts, he was stabbed 23 times, a number that showed not just a desire to kill him, but a desire to destroy him. Each conspirator, including his supposed friends, wanted a piece of the tyrant, each blow a symbol of their vengeance for the republic they believed he had murdered. The attack was not clean or efficient. It was a desperate, chaotic frenzy of betrayal and violence. In his final moments, a scene of shocking personal drama unfolded. As he lay dying, he is said to have seen his beloved friend and ward, Marcus Junius Brutus, among the conspirators holding a dagger. It was then that the deacon, having Caesar in a final heartbroken act of recognition, uttered the most famous last words in all of history. "Et tu, Brute? You too, Brutus?" It was a moment of profound betrayal and personal agony. A man realizing that his greatest enemy was not a rival general, but the son he had loved and protected. The immediate aftermath was one of total chaos. The conspirators, their hands covered in blood, fled the scene, shouting that the tyrant was dead and the republic was restored. The senators who had not been part of the plot scattered in terror. Caesar's body lay on the Senate floor for hours, a symbol of the violence that had just consumed their world. His death, a public spectacle of vengeance, plunged Rome into a state of shock and uncertainty. The civil war was over, but the brutal murder had only created a new, far more dangerous power vacuum that would lead to an even bloodier conflict. His loyal lieutenant, Marcus Antonius, known to history as Mark Antony, was the first to grasp the political significance of Caesar's death. He did not immediately avenge his friend. Instead, he acted with a chilling, calculated patience. He retrieved the body from the Senate and, using his immense charisma, arranged a public funeral in the Roman Forum. This was not an act of mourning, but a masterclass in political theater. He used the event to turn the tide of public opinion against the conspirators, speaking with a controlled fury about the great man who had been murdered by his so-called friends, a man who had loved his people. The reading of Caesar's will was the final devastating blow to the conspirators' cause. In a public ceremony, Caesar's will was read aloud, revealing his final brilliant act of populism. He had left a large sum of money to every single citizen of Rome. The Roman mob, now inflamed by Mark Antony's words and by the promise of their own personal wealth, turned on the conspirators with a furious rage. But the most shocking revelation was his heir. He had named not Mark Antony his loyal general, but his 18-year-old great-nephew, Gaius Octavius, as his adopted son and primary heir. The reaction of the Roman people to his assassination was a testament to the power of his populism. They had loved him in life, and they now saw his murder as a betrayal of their trust. The funeral pyre in the Forum became a public monument to their rage. They rioted, setting fire to the homes of the assassins and driving them from the city. The conspirators, who had expected to be hailed as heroes and saviors of the Republic, were instead hunted like common criminals. Their plan had failed spectacularly. They had killed the tyrant but had failed to win over the people, and they now faced an angry city that wanted vengeance. His death left a political vacuum of terrifying proportions. The conspirators had no plan for the day after the assassination. They had no army, no popular support, and no clear leader. They had killed the man they feared, but they had no idea how to bring the Republic back to life. The city of Rome was plunged into a new kind of chaos, with rival factions vying for control, a population that was furious and demanding justice, and no one with the moral or military authority to unite them. The final act of the Republic's tragedy was about to begin, a bloody war of succession that would destroy the very thing the conspirators had sought to save. The power vacuum was filled by three ruthless and ambitious men: Caesar's former loyalists, Mark Antony and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, and his adopted son and heir, the young Octavian. They formed the Second Triumvirate, a brutal, officially sanctioned alliance with one singular goal: to hunt down and destroy the assassins of Caesar. The war that followed was far more brutal and bloody than the civil war that had preceded it. They hunted down Brutus and Cassius, defeating them in the Battle of Philippi. The final vestiges of the Republic were utterly destroyed, and the stage was set for the rise of an emperor, the very thing the conspirators had sought to prevent. The single most significant impact of Gaius Julius Caesar's life was that it irrevocably killed the Roman Republic and gave birth to the Roman Empire. His assassination, intended to restore the old order, had the opposite effect. It created a power vacuum so volatile that it could only be filled by a single supreme authority. The bloody civil wars that followed his death were the final brutal spasms of a dying state, and when the dust settled, the Roman people, weary of conflict, were willing to trade their liberty for peace and security. His life and the chaos of his death made the rise of an emperor an inevitable, irreversible historical event. The Republic was dead, and he had been its executioner. Of his many reforms, his most enduring legacy was the Julian calendar. The old Roman calendar was a mess of political manipulation and inaccurate reckoning, a chaotic system that had no basis in scientific fact. Caesar, with the help of the astronomer Sosigenes of Alexandria, reformed the calendar, creating a system based on a solar year of 365.25 days. His new calendar, the Julian calendar, was a revolutionary feat of scientific and political genius. It was a reform that was so profound, so necessary, that it was not replaced for 16 centuries, a testament to the fact that his mind was as capable of scientific clarity as it was of military conquest. His legacy was cemented in the most dramatic way possible: his deification. After his assassination, his adopted son and heir, the young Octavian, had him officially declared a god by the Roman Senate, an act that was both a posthumous honor and a chilling political calculation. He was given the title Divus Julius, the divine Julius, and a cult of personality was built around him, a new state religion that gave his adopted son a direct lineage to a god. This act was the final total victory for Caesar, a man who had sought absolute power and even in death had achieved a kind of divine, unchallengeable authority. His name, Caesar, transcended his personal identity to become a title of absolute power. For centuries, rulers of other nations would take on his name as a symbol of their own supremacy. The Germanic rulers would call themselves Kaiser, and the Russian emperors would call themselves Tsar, each a direct phonetic derivative of Caesar's name. This was a testament to his immense influence, a symbol of the fact that he was not just a man, but a political archetype, a blueprint for a kind of absolute, undeniable power that would be emulated by dictators and emperors for thousands of years. His influence on military strategy and political thought cannot be overstated. His written accounts of his campaigns, Commentari de Bello Gallico and Commentari de Bello Civili, became required reading for future generations of generals. He was a master of siege warfare, a brilliant tactician, and a general who knew how to inspire total, unwavering loyalty. His populist political strategies, using public works and lavish games to win the support of the common people, would be a model for demagogues and political leaders for centuries to come. He was a man who saw the world as a game, and he was the master player. His life was a brutal, Astonishing story of ambition and betrayal. Born into a fading noble family, he navigated a political landscape of civil war and proscription. He was a master of his own destiny, using his intellect, his charisma, and his ruthless will to ascend from a penniless exile to the undisputed master of the Roman world. He was a military genius who conquered a continent, a politician who bent a republic to his will, and a man who in his final moments was betrayed by the very people he had shown mercy to. His life was not a tragedy. It was a brutal spectacle of human will, a testament to what a single determined man could achieve through sheer force and cunning. The death of Julius Caesar, intended to be a final cleansing act of republican virtue, was in fact the beginning of the end. The conspirators, in their final act of misguided vengeance, had not freed the republic. They had delivered it a fatal blow from which it would never recover. They had removed the tyrant, but they had left a vacuum that was filled not by freedom, but by a new civil war, a conflict of terrifying scope and brutality that would ultimately end in the death of the last vestiges of the old Roman state and the rise of a new kind of ruler, the emperor. His legacy, therefore, is a complex and dark one. He was not a king, and he did not rule an empire. But his life and death, his ambition and his assassination, created the conditions that made the empire possible and made the existence of an emperor an inevitable, irreversible fact of history. He was the most brilliant man of his age, a man who saw the flaws in a dying system and had the courage and the ruthlessness to tear it down, and in doing so he laid the foundation for the most powerful empire the world had ever known. In the end, his life was not a story of heroism, but a study in power. He was a man who understood that power was not given, but taken, and that to rule a world, one had to be willing to destroy it. He was a figure so immense, so consequential, that he became a symbol of a certain kind of absolute, unchallengeable power. He was a man who saw himself as a god, and in the end, his ambition and his hubris were so great that the world he ruled had no choice but to kill him, a final act of self-preservation against a force that could not be stopped. In the final reckoning, Gaius Julius Caesar was a man who lived and died not for Rome, but for himself. His life was an astonishing, bloody drama of ambition, power, and betrayal, a story that continues to captivate and terrify us to this day. His ghost would go on to haunt the Roman world for centuries, a constant reminder of what a single, ruthless man was capable of. His life was a terrifying warning, a lesson that when one man's ambition is allowed to grow unchecked, an entire world can be brought to its knees